Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Genuinely thrilled to be here. I love MIT as an institution. It is not one of those schools that I talk about when I'm talking about all of our sort of sclerotic, paralyzed universities, because MIT is doing so much in so many areas that it can be excused for having a limited bandwidth and trying to accomplish all the things that it's doing. And what I'm really going to be talking about here today are universities that were built from scratch for very selected purposes. And in so doing, they were able to kind of clear the deck of constraints, of legacies, of historical tradition, and start from scratch for the moment and build them true to the needs of either the country they were in or the world that they were trying to change. And as a collection of institutions, they've accomplished amazing things in just 20 years. They're about the same age as our undergraduate students. And they also provide hope, I think, and inspiration for the rest of the sector in that first they're able to pilot a lot of new types of curriculum, new types of teaching, new kinds of administrative structures. And they're also, this is something else that they do, is whenever someone says higher ed is hopelessly broken, you can point to these universities and say, no, they're not. They're these new universities that barged onto the scene, and they're doing fantastic things. And in many cases, large universities are also doing fantastic new things in various sort of institutes and sort of, skunk work type special projects areas. But these are institutions where the entire institution was created at once, from scratch, for a purpose. And the fact that they have this purpose, and that everyone knows this purpose, and everyone was brought on board for this purpose, energizes them and connects them in a really exciting way. So that's kind of the setup for the talk. This is me. As I mentioned before, I've been teaching forever. And from my time at little liberal arts colleges, I like to think that at least I've put undergraduate education at the top of my own personal mission in terms of teaching physics and astronomy in ways that center students and most importantly, connect with them from where they are, either from their cultural or other vantage point, and allows them also to experience science in authentic ways. So that's kind of been my mission. And I actually have another book, which I've been talking with David about, on models of time and space throughout human culture. And I've written a lot about archaeoastronomy and things like that as well in my other life as an astronomer. But what brought me into this particular project was, and again, since I'm an astronomer, I will resort to astronomical analogies, apologies. But what brought me out of my orbit in the liberal arts college, allowed me to escape the surface gravity of that college, was the sort of impulse of creating a new liberal arts college from scratch. The idea came first from Singapore, and they approached Pomona College and the other Claremonts, and they said, hey, we want to build a liberal arts college in Singapore. And a lot of us got really excited. This was way back before Yale got a hold of it, way back in 2007. That's a long time ago. And that, at that point, was so energizing for me. I was part of a little committee that was talking about this, trying to figure out what we would keep from our little college in Claremont and what we'd leave behind. And it was so energizing to imagine that freedom to invent. So that got me really fired up about it. And when Yale got the deal from Singapore, I immediately emailed my friend Charles Balin, who's an astronomer at Yale, and he said, yeah, come on over. And within a month, I was on an airplane in New Haven talking about the curriculum. And then I spent a year on campus helping design the curriculum, and 3 years in Singapore. We moved our little family, our 2 dogs, our daughter, and 8 suitcases, and set up in Singapore for 3 years and helped launch the college. After 3 years out there, where I set up a teaching learning center, did a lot with the science curriculum, I came out to Ashoka University, where I've been for the last 6 years. And this year, I'm happily on sabbatical, visiting all kinds of great institutions around New England, learning about the current state of higher education. Okay, so that's our book. Again, available at fine retail outlets. And I also have a discount code at the end, too, if you want to get it 30% off. It genuinely is a good read, I think. And I'll give my co-author a lot of credit for that, because when you write something with a co-author, they actually correct a lot of your flaws and grammatical and rhetorical excesses and vice versa. So we tried to design it to be sort of lean and focus on the stories of these, what you might call academic entrepreneurs. And that was the point, was to showcase the stories, so the human stories of these 8 colleges. We picked the 8 colleges because they all had sort of similar size and somewhat similar missions. They were both dedicated primarily to undergraduate education. They were mostly global in their ambitions to weld together a community of students from around the world. And they were all focused on kind of changing the paradigm for undergraduate education. And among the group are some that you may have heard of. Your neighbor, Olin College of Engineering, which in the book we have a quote from Rick Miller, the founding president, where he sort of joked about the early days. And what Rick said was, hey, there's about 5 of us faculty and a dozen students in a farmhouse up the road, MIT, and we're going to reshape engineering education. And he thought it was so hilarious that they were doing that they were in the farmhouse, sort of, you know, like sort of Don Quixote going after MIT. They weren't really going after MIT, but they were very ambitiously trying to reshape engineering education. So I'm sure Olin College is the one that you might have most familiarity with. Minerva University also had a similar bold entry into the scene where Ben Nelson, the founder, put his chips on the table and said, okay, Harvard, we're going to offer a $10,000 education. And within a decade or two, our students will be running circles around yours, and we'll be actually able to get the same kind of students that you are. And he also had ambitions to grow it and eventually have it be a model for like a next generation of university. We can talk about why that hasn't quite played out, but they have actually had selectivity in the 2 to 4% range. So they're at least grabbing students that are of the same caliber as the ones that are going to Harvard. And I've met some of them, they're amazing. And some of these other ones you may or may not have heard of. In the US, generally, universities only make the headlines when something goes wrong. And that certainly happened this year. Or when they somehow affect the US. And one of the interesting things about this project is we really were amazed and happily surprised by the surge of interest around the world in what we call liberal arts, but you might just call holistic and humanistic forms of education that center undergraduates, their interests, their talents in the education, giving time for them to explore their interests and to develop diverse intellectual capacities. That was a revolutionary idea in a lot of countries. It just was not available. And we see huge amounts of interest across Africa, across South Asia, in this fancy, exotic, unusual liberal arts model. And the asymmetry, the mirroring of what's happening in the US, where people are disaffected with liberal arts, and where there's a surge of interest and enthusiasm across Asia and Africa for liberal arts, we found striking. Sure, they still want their technical educations in those countries, but they haven't had a chance for, especially their leaders, to benefit from the time to really step back a little bit, reflect, and think deeply. And so a lot of these schools are really accomplishing great things in training a next generation of leaders. So they came up with mission statements, some of them interesting, some of them the usual kind of vague word salad that many mission statements have. Some of them are unique, though, in the world of higher education, and some of them are, of course, very bold. You see often world in the mission statement, in Asia for the world, for the sake of the world. And that's partly why we came up with this global university idea, is that not only are they comprised of students from around the world, but they also have a global outlook. And they really do want to have their curriculum, their students, their faculty, really focusing on problems that affect the world and try to help, have impact on those. So these are the 8 that we studied in some depth. And because we wrote it during the COVID time, we weren't able to actually visit the campuses, although Noah, my co-author, and I have been to, I think, all of the campuses here except for the 2 ones in Africa, which we do want to go to, and sometimes multiple times. But we were able to get access to all the leaders instantly by Zoom, and it was fantastic getting to know them. Okay, so in many cases, these campuses have built, these colleges and universities have built beautiful campuses. And that's certainly the case for Yale-NUS, where I was for several years. They had this beautiful campus built by this architect, Pelly, I believe was the name of this firm. And it rose literally from a hole in the ground. It was part of a golf course. And they took a time-lapse movie of it, which they would sometimes use. They just had a camera setting on the building across the way, and you see the building just kind of rise up from the ground in the space of 2 or 3 years. The whole campus, including like 30-story high residence halls, just are rising, kind of growing like bamboo in the back of National University of Singapore. That was fantastic to watch, and it also in some ways mirrored some of the dynamism of Singapore and some of the other Asian economies, where they place education squarely in the center of their national strategic strategies. They have, in Singapore, very few people and very few resources. There are only about 5 million people in Singapore. They have no water even, like they have to import water from Malaysia. They don't have any other resources except their people. And so Singapore is focused squarely on education as one of their real strategic priorities, because they know that their real resource is their people. And so Yale-NUS arose from a couple of decades of strategic planning that Singapore had made. And so often when Americans think of Yale-NUS, they think of the Americans. But in many ways, it should have been called NUS, Yale College, because NUS had been developing prototypes of this for 2 decades before Yale showed up. And so, interestingly too, in the last year, NUS has decided to take full control of it. So instead of now being called Yale-NUS College, it's actually NUS College. And that was kind of a sad moment for a lot of the people involved in the founding of it, but it's in some ways a sign of it coming of age in a way that Singapore is sort of taking full control of this venture, as it has many others. And the book tells the story of Singapore, of Richard Levin from Yale, of Charles Balin and my other friend, Pericles Lewis, the first president, and Chor Chuan Tan, the president of Singapore, National University of Singapore, who had the idea, along with Richard Levin, to build the place. So this one, because I spent years there and helped build it, is a very personal and meaningful story for me, and we enjoyed writing it. The other one's Olin College, just up the road. I've gotten to know a lot of the faculty there. I was actually just at Olin College yesterday, and having studied the place in this level of detail in its younger days as a baby university, and then seeing it now in its 20-plus-year-old configuration, it's also really interesting to watch the developmental phases of universities. And they start out, just like people do maybe, with unbounded optimism, youthful enthusiasm, impetuousness, a little bit wild, and eventually they settle down into kind of a middle age at age 20. And so Olin College and a lot of schools like it are working on that sort of next phase of a startup, when you become established, when you become prestigious, and when you then have to figure out what your next role is. You're no longer a startup, so what do? Do you help other universities start up? Do you try to reclaim that original sort of effervescence of the founding? Or do you just settle in and enjoy your prestige and enjoy your place being ranked alongside MIT as the most innovative engineering education institution in the world, which did happen, and they're very quick to point that out. So in many ways, Rick Miller's challenge was met. Other examples, Ashesi University in Ghana, fantastic place, founded by a fellow named Patrick Oua, who was a graduate from Swarthmore. And we tell the story of his life as he left Africa and came to the US and became educated, became wealthy as an executive at Microsoft. And in his own words, he says he turned his back on Africa. And he was raising his kids, and he was living the great American dream. And then the genocide happened in Rwanda, and he read about it. And there's a story, we quote him in the book. He looked in his son's eyes, and he realized he's always going to be seen as someone who arose from Africa. And he realized he had an obligation. And so from that point on, he dedicated himself to building this university in Africa called Ashesi University. And the mission of Ashesi is to build what he calls an African Renaissance. He has a vision of training a new generation of ethical entrepreneurial leaders to bring about a renaissance in Africa. And it's so inspiring talking with him. He's won a MacArthur Genius Award. He's gotten great amounts of support from around the world. And his institution now, again about 20 years old, has picked up partnerships with some of the top universities in the world, including ETH in Switzerland, where they have a mechatronics master's degree. And I don't really know what mechatronics is, but it sounds really advanced and complicated. I'm sure you guys here at MIT know it. And so they're able to train students in liberal arts type approaches, especially focusing on leadership, because that's their core mission, and then feed them in to government, to industry, other top roles across Ghana. And what's really beautiful about this place as well is that it, in many ways, is reversing the brain drain that otherwise is happening from a lot of the global south. They're top people. They study hard in high school. First chance they get, kind of like Patrick did, they jump on an airplane and they're off to UK, off to the US. And so their top people aren't able to stay in country to really deal with some of the issues there. And they're very proud of the fact that a big majority of their students are staying in Africa after graduation and are already having a pretty big impact on not only Ghana, but some of the neighboring countries. Ashoka University in India, another interesting place. This one was founded by a group that were rooted in complex types of technical fields and entrepreneurship. And they, ironically, decided that the best thing to do after they became successful is to create a liberal arts college. And they did it not because they were experts in liberal arts, but because they realized that that's what they missed in India. And Pramath Sinha, he's one of the founders that we got to know really well. Pramath, he tells his tale of when he was in India, like all good kids, he trained and trained and trained to get into IIT. He got into IIT. He was admitted into something called metallurgical engineering, which he didn't know what it was at the time, but he knew it was good to get into IIT. He became a metallurgical engineer, at least he had a degree, and then promptly went off to the US, to around the world, started companies, was just a businessman. And he realized he missed out on really being able to deeply engage on some of these larger issues of the human condition. So he, along with Ashish Dhawan, who was a venture capitalist in Delhi, designed this new university. And it started out not as a university, but as kind of a one-year immersion into liberal arts for recent Indian graduates. And so in that guise, it was called the Young India Fellowship. And they ran it for 10 years. And they would capture the most dynamic, intelligent people emerging from all the IITs and IIMs who, like Pramath, had missed out on that kind of education. And they spent a year together as a cohort studying poetry, studying ancient epics, going into low-income communities and interviewing people, doing projects, starting NGOs. And this 10-year run of this little group, they were sort of in this corner of Delhi. They didn't have a campus. They were borrowing like a community center, the Aurobindo Community Center. It grew into something very prestigious because they were grabbing the top people from all the IITs, and they were also roping in Nobel Prize winners and others to give short courses. And so that prestige factor was folded into the place as it became a university. And Ashish and Pramath also raised a fantastic amount of money because they knew all the venture capitalists around the area. And they created what is now India's largest philanthropic venture. Ashoka University raised a lot of money, and they're doubling the size of their campus, and they're really highly regarded, and they're sort of a prototype of liberal arts in India that has sort of led a movement across India. And now there's about a dozen liberal arts schools that have popped up, all privately funded. These are some of the others that we talk about. NYU Abu Dhabi, we tell the tale of John Sexton and his quest to create a global university that NYU being one of several global portal campuses, as he puts it. And in his idea, the university is a place for what he calls secular ecumenism, which is sort of an odd term, but it refers to the fact that John, who had a background in theology before he became a lawyer, had almost like a religious zeal for the power of a university to navigate across all different kinds of differences and to be a space where people could work out those differences. And he gives the analogy of New York City as a global talent magnet where people from all around the world are merging and clashing and finding themselves and finding each other. And he wanted to create kind of a microcosm of that at NYU Abu Dhabi. and did. There's something like 110 nations represented in their students. When it was founded, they were again drawing in that sort of 2 to 4% range of applicants. And it got a reputation as the world's honor college. You could get in there from any country on earth. They would give you full financial aid, and you would have access to this amazing top flight kind of education. So NYU Abu Dhabi is doing great. It's now growing and getting graduate programs. It outproduces in research and patents a lot of universities, 5 or 10 times its size. And it's really an amazing place. And then the last three, I don't have time to kind of go through a rundown of all of them because I have other slides. But the last three, Fulbright Vietnam was founded partly with money that you could think of as reparations for the Vietnam War. They were coming out of the State Department. When the place was dedicated, Barack Obama went out there, and John Kerry had a role also in helping them in the early days. And they get a steady infusion of money from the US State Department. And we tell the stories of their founders. It includes a fellow named Tom Vallely, who's from here. And he himself was a Marine in the Vietnam War. And he wanted to try to help Vietnam after having his youth spent in the war. And so he had this incredible passion for this project and was able to marshal an existing Harvard leadership program in Vietnam and transform it with State Department money into a full-fledged undergraduate program. So it's now running, and it's very prestigious and offers a unique kind of liberal arts education that includes a Vietnam studies course that all the students take, which is the only one of its kind, I think, in the world, where the students are able to contemplate what they call the American War and really engage deeply with both sides fully represented. And so it becomes a meeting place of these two viewpoints that are put right next to each other. All of the students are Vietnamese, but they're engaging with this context that Vietnam finds itself in as emerging from the Vietnam War and sort of trying to rise up to be a top industrial and technical power. Really interesting place. And then the last two, African Leadership University and Minerva, they're pioneering what some are calling the cost disease in higher education. African Leadership University has a goal. It's founded by a really charismatic fellow named Fred Swaniker, and he wants to create a $3,000 a year program. And he's grown it into something that he hopes to scale up to reach 3 million students. And so he started out with a small little campus in Mauritius. He built a second campus in Rwanda, and he's built a whole bunch of these little nodes across Africa that he calls ALX. And he's growing steadily and offering a mix of in-person, online, vocational, on-the-job training, and even student-led seminars in order to help push the costs down. And he's done really amazing work, and that place, like Ashesi University, is hoping to transform on an even larger scale some of the leadership in Africa. And then finally, Minerva University, I mentioned them early. This is their campus. They don't have a campus. And so that was kind of a radical cost savings. Yeah, we don't need a campus. They invented their own platform. This is before Zoom existed. And this was way back in those days of like 2007, if you remember what that was like. We didn't even have intelligent phones in those days. But they invented a full-on interactive online platform that allowed faculty to teach from anywhere and to monitor their students' progress in terms of the contributions in class, and to really rapidly configure discussion groups and other project presentations. And then they also designed a curriculum with top scholars from Stanford, Harvard, elsewhere. And so it was a really interesting experiment. The students rotate through a set of 6 global cities where they operate, the university operates what amounts to an apartment building in each of these cities. San Francisco is the first one they start in, and they go through cities like Buenos Aires, Shanghai. They were in India, I think it's New Delhi, and they would rotate through these cities for each semester so that students could then get this global education, and then they themselves were global, just like NYU Abu Dhabi, and could then really experience all these different cultures. Okay, so that's my kind of overview of the 8 schools. I'm almost out of time. So what I want to do here is just sort of take some of the context and in some ways flip it. And I mentioned before, this is how Noah and I, when we started the book, we had this sort of storm clouds kind of like when Snoopy is writing a novel, if you remember that. He's on his doghouse. It was a dark and stormy night. So that's kind of how we wanted to start the book. And there are storm clouds in higher education, but you have to put ... in the US. We talk about the demographic cliff. We talk about our overcapacity, and we see doom. And yet, around the world, those numbers are reversed. There's a surge of young people in India and Africa, and a very much less crowded map of higher education institutions. So this global aspect is really different. But even within the US, you can actually argue that because of the fact that we have a crowded marketplace, and because these schools are frankly underperforming in a lot of ways, they're not, the students are just leaving, they're not even graduating, something needs to be done. And this has been also accompanied by disaffection by students and their parents. Not only is there a demographic cliff, this is sort of showing a plot from Nathan Graw, who has a really good publication on this. The demographics show this cliff, something like 20 or more % fewer young people in the coming decade, but it's accompanied by disaffection, meaning that the actual decline of college-going students will be even worse. And this is partly because of the underperformance in terms of graduation rates, but also because of a disaffection, a lack of persuasion that the cost that they're spending for higher education is worth it. So what happens? Will our universities change? Will they evolve? Will they? And so you can actually give a lot of arguments why that won't happen. Partially just from inertia, and partially just to the very conservative nature of higher education itself. And this is a famous quote from Clark Kerr pointing out that the universities themselves are not only the most conservative institutions in our civilization, but also the longest lived. And that's of value in a world where you need to preserve civilization. So that curatorial function of university is certainly valid, but I would argue that at this moment, when the future is so massively different than the past, we maybe need to ramp up our game a little bit and focus less on curating the past and more on adapting to this crazy future we're barging into. Brian Rosenberg over at Harvard also wrote a new book, which is dealing with change. And what he entitled the book is Whatever It Is, I'm Against It. And it sort of encapsulates some of the attitudes that many faculty have about change. They don't see that the system is broken somehow, and yet it is. And they even if they do see it broken, they don't know how to change it. Okay, so one could imagine this as a time where higher ed is ripe for disruption. And I spent a lot of time learning the lingo of disruptive innovation because I do think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the corporate entrepreneurship that apply to the academic entrepreneurship. And in the disruptive innovation model, as you do sustaining innovations, which all of our campuses are doing, new curriculum here, new center here, new program there, the performance goes up, but also the cost goes up. And at a certain point, you cross the level that either students can absorb or afford, and you're ripe for disruptive innovation. So in the technological model, you'll have some new technology, some new business model, and you'll have a different kind of notion of value. And certainly, I was just at the ASU GSV meeting, there are many people who are putting their chips on technology as being that magic ingredient that will fix all of our problems. But this enabling technology doesn't really do that. And I was talking along the way over here, think about what they were saying about online learning about a decade ago. The MOOC, everything's going to change. We're going to disrupt education with online learning. What happened? We're still here. Universities are still open. Students don't want to listen to a canned lecture in a box, right? So that enabling technology, I think, was misnamed. It's the online learning is actually not really learning in most cases. I mean, sure, you can learn online, but there's no substitute for actually being one-on-one with a person, actual human being, in a lab or in a classroom, in a seminar, and interpersonally engaging with other students. And that's why the university endures in its physical form. In the same way, at this moment where AI is barging in everywhere, you can think about that maybe in the same way as being misnamed. Artificial intelligence, just like online learning, is a little bit misnamed because when you think about it, what you have in your pocket with a chatbot is really not intelligent. And so in that way, if we think about education, we're trying to cultivate not just factual recall, which AI does very well, but deeper forms of intelligence. So I will posit that yes, AI will change everything on our campuses, but not in the way that people think. It's not the Clayton Christensen disruptive innovation thing any more than the online learning was. So that's about all I'm going to say about the disruptive innovation thing, because I'm almost out of time. But I do want to take a moment and talk about leadership, because the book really focuses on the founders of the schools and their leadership styles. And I think that's part of the recipe that enables schools to be started from scratch. You need a really powerful leader. And I picked this up actually from Michael Horn, a friend from Harvard. And in his work, he's written about the way that a company will shift between these quadrants as they move through their life cycle. And I've noticed too that universities do the same. So when you have a new company, you start out here. You have a broad consensus about what you're trying to do. Everyone's on board. We're going to change the world by doing a B2B cloud-based provider of all business services, and the world will be a better place. Everyone's on board. They sign up. Everyone's excited by the vision. So this is a vision kind of quadrant. And then as time develops, as you begin to figure out what you're doing and how to do it, you move over here and you begin to form a culture. And a lot of the stories in the book are about that transition from a vision to a culture as people kind of crammed together in rented farmhouse or bungalows in Ghana, or in our case, we rented an old unused dorm at NUS as our campus was being built. And they hammer out the curriculum, they work with each other, and they form a culture. And that academic culture is so interesting as it assembles and as it gets built. Now, most of us, when we come to a campus, we inherit curriculum and culture, and it's very difficult to change. And in fact, over time, a university will transition from this point where there's broad consensus about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and we'll fall into this quadrant where most universities are here, where everyone has a different idea of what the university is for, but you have a certain amount of procedures that everyone agrees on, so you keep the machine running, except in cases where things begin to get a little bit dysfunctional, and then you go into this quadrant here, where your leadership style, instead of relying on vision and hope, I love these terms, this is from his paper, revolve on fiat, coercion, threats. It becomes a little bit more, Hobbesian in this quadrant. And what we really want is to keep our universities from getting here, and ideally we want to move them up here where they can have a better idea of why they're here. And so that's kind of the lesson I want to try to give from this. Like, how do these utopic types of experiments translate into my university? Well, you can't obviously restart your university, it's all here. But we can all work to have a better consensus about why we're here. And we can all work, just as the founders did, in sort of thinking through the institution from top to bottom and really questioning, like, why are we doing what we're doing? Because it's an exciting process to have that reimagining. And so that's one reason why we wrote the book, is we really want to inspire other universities to have that kind of reawakening, reinvention, if you will. So I'm going to just skip over all these extra slides, and if you guys invite me back, I'll be happy to give a longer talk. And these are some of the representative quotes from our leaders. And I'll just end up on this one, which is our friend, Albert Einstein. And the reason why I love this is because of the idea of imagination and creativity, which I think is another part of the equation, that everyone really should be drawing more on their imagination and really together, collectively creating that future university that they want. So I love that possibility. So anyway, that's it. That's my shameless promotional flyers. And with that, I guess we'll pause. So thank you, everyone.